Holy War. Diabolus enters the town. Now these being dead, what do the rest of the townfolk, but as men that had found a fool's paradise? They presently, as afore was hinted, fell to prove the truth of the giant's words. And first they did as ill Pause had taught them. They looked, they considered, they were taken with the forbidden fruit. They took thereof, and did eat. And having eaten, they became immediately drunken therewith. So they opened the gates, both ear gate and eye gate, and let in Diabolus, with all his babes, quite forgetting their good Shaddai, his law, and the judgments that he had annexed with solemn threatenings to the breach thereof. Diabolus, having now obtained entrance in at the gates of the town, marches up to the middle thereof, to make his conquest as sure as he could, and finding by this time the affections of the people warmly inclining to him, he thinking it was best striking while the iron was hot, made this further deceivable speech unto them, saying, Alas, my poor man-soul, I have done thee indeed this service, as to promote thee to honor, and to greaten thy liberty. But alas, alas, poor man-soul, thou wantest now one to defend thee. For assure thyself, when Shaddai shall hear what is done, he will come. For sorry will he be that thou hast broken his bonds, and cast his cords away from thee. What wilt thou do? Wilt thou, after enlargement, suffer thy privileges to be invaded? Satan gains the heart. Invaded and taken away? Or what wilt thou resolve with thyself? Then they all with one consent said to this bramble, Do thou reign over us? So he accepted the motion, and became the king of the town of Mansoul. This being done, the next thing was to give him possession of the castle, and so of the whole strength of the town. Wherefore into the castle he goes. It was that which Shaddai built in Mansoul for his own delight and pleasure. This was now become a den and hold for the giant Diabolus. Now having got possession of this stately palace or castle, what doth he but make it a garrison for himself, and strengthens and fortifies it with all sorts of provisions against the king Shaddai, or those that should endeavor the regaining of it to him and his obedience again. This done, but not thinking himself yet secure enough, in the next place he bethinks himself of new modeling the town. And so he does, setting up one and putting down another at pleasure. Wherefore my Lord Mayor, whose name was my Lord Understanding, and Mr. Recorder, whose name was Mr. Conscience, these he put out of place and power. As for my Lord Mayor, though he was an understanding man, and one too that had complied with the rest of the town of Mansoul in admitting the giant into the town, yet Diabolus thought not fit to let him abide in his former luster and glory, because he was a seeing man. He darkens their understanding. He was a seeing man. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 and 5. Okay. Luster and glory, because he was a seeing man. Wherefore he had darkened him not only by taking from him his office and power, but by building of an high and strong tower, just between the sun's reflections and the windows of my Lord's palace, by which means the house, and the whole of his habitation, was made as dark as darkness itself. And thus being alienated from the light, he became as one that was born blind. Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. So he became as one that was born blind. To this house my Lord was confined, as to a prison, nor might he upon his parole go further than within his own bounds. And now had he had an heart to do good for man's soul, what could he do for it? Or wherein could he be profitable to her? So then, as long as man's soul was under the power and government of Diabolus, and so long it was under him, as it was obedient to him, which was even until by a war it was rescued out of his hand, so long my Lord Mayor was rather an impediment in than an advantage to the famous town of Mansoul. As for Mr. Recorder, before the town was taken, conscience shakes the sinner at times. Before the town was taken, he was a man well read in the laws of his king, and also a man of courage and faithfulness to speak truth on every occasion. And he had a tongue as bravely hung, as he had an head filled with judgment. Now this man, Diabolus could by no means abide, because though he gave his consent to his coming into the town, yet he could not by all wiles, trials, stratagems, and devices that he could use make him his own. True, he was much degenerated from his former king, and also much pleased with the giant's service, and many of his laws. But this would not do, for as much as he was not wholly his, he would now and then think upon Shaddai, and have a dread of his law upon him. And then he would speak against Diabolus with a voice as great as when a lion roareth. Yea, and would also at certain times, when his fits were upon him, for you must know that sometimes he had terrible fits, make the whole town of Mansoul shake with his voice, and therefore the new king of Mansoul could not abide him. Diabolus therefore feared the recorder more than any that was left alive in the town of Mansoul, because, as I said, his words did shake the whole town. They were like the rattling of thunder, and also like thunderclaps. Since therefore the giant could not make him wholly his own, what doth he do, but studies all that he could to debauch the old gentleman, and by debauchery to stupefy his mind, and more harden his heart in the ways of vanity. Conscience stupefies and disregarded. Let's see, and more harden his heart in the ways of vanity. And as he attempted, so he accomplished his design. He debauched the man, and by little and little so drew him into sin and wickedness, that at last he was not only debauched as at first, and so by consequence defiled, but was almost, at last I say, past all conscience of sin. And this was the farthest Diabolus could go. Wherefore he bethinks him of another project, and that was to persuade the men of the town that Mr. Recorder was mad, and so not to be regarded, And for this he urged his fits, and said, If he be himself, why doth he not do thus always? But, quoth he, all mad folk have their fits, and in them raving language, so hath this old and doting gentleman. Thus by one means or other he quickly got man-soul to slight, neglect, and despise whatever Mr. Recorder could say. For, besides what you have already heard, Diabolus had a way to make the old gentleman, when he was merry, unsay and deny what he in his fits had affirmed. And indeed this was the next way to make himself ridiculous, and to cause that no man should regard him. Also now he never spake freely for King Shaddai, but always by force and constraint. Besides, he would at one time be hot against that about which at another he would hold his peace. So uneven was he now in his doings. Sometimes he would be as if fast asleep, and again sometimes as dead. Even then, when the whole town of Mansoul was in her career after vanity, and in her dance after the giant's pipe. Satan persuades that God gives up the sinner. Wherefore sometimes, when Mansoul did used to be frighted with the thundering voice of the recorder that was, and when they did tell Diabolus of it, he would answer, that what the old gentleman said was neither out of love to him, nor pity to them, but of a foolish fondness that he had to be prating, and so would hush still, and put all to quiet again, and that he might leave no argument unurged that might tend to make them secure. He said, and said it often, O Mansoul, consider that notwithstanding the old gentleman's rage, and the rattle of his high and thundering words, you hear nothing of Shaddai himself. When, liar and deceiver that he was, every outcry of Mr. Recorder against the sin of Mansoul was the voice of God in him to them. But he goes on and says, You see that he values not the loss nor rebellion of the town of Mansoul, nor will he trouble himself with calling his town to a reckoning, for their giving themselves to me. He knows that though ye were his, now you are lawfully mine. So leaving us to one another, he hath now shaken his hands of us. Moreover, O Mansoul, quoth he, considering how I have served you, even to the uttermost of my power, and that with the best that I have could get or procure for you in all the world. Besides, I dare say that the laws and customs that you now are under, and by which you do homage to me, do yield you more solace and content than did the paradise that at first you possessed. Conscience cannot be quieted or subdued. Paradise that at first you possessed. Your liberty also, as yourselves do very well know, has been greatly widened and enlarged by me. Whereas I found you a penned-up people, I have not laid any restraint upon you. You have no law, statute, or judgment of mine to fright you. I call none of you to account for your doings except the madman. You know who I mean. I have granted you to live, each man like a prince in his own palace, even with as little control from me as I have from you. And thus would Diabolus hush up and quiet the town of Mansoul, when the recorder that was, did at times molest them. Yea, and with such cursed orations as these, would set the whole town in a rage and fury against the old gentleman. Yea, the rascally crew at sometimes would be for destroying him. They have often wished, in my hearing, that he had lived 1,000 miles off from them. His company, his words, yea, the very sight of him, and especially when they remembered how in old times he did use to threaten and condemn them, for all he was now so debauched, did terrify and afflict them sore. But all their wishes were vain, for I don't know how, unless by the power of Shaddai, and his wisdom, he was preserved in being amongst them. Besides, his house was as strong as a castle, and stood hard by a stronghold of the town. Moreover, if at any time any of the crew or rabble attempted to make him away, he could pull up the sluices and let in such floods as would drown all round about him. The will corrupted by pride. But to leave Mr. Recorder and to come to my Lord Will be Will, another of the famous town of Mansell. This Will be Will was as high-born in Mansell, and was as much, if not more, a freeholder than many of them were. Besides, if I remember my tale aright, he had some privileges peculiar to himself in the famous town of Mansell. Now, together with these, he was a man of great strength, resolution, and courage, nor in his occasion could any turn him away. But I say, whether he was proud of his estate, privileges, strength, or what, but sure it was through pride of something. He scorns now to be a slave in Mansell, and therefore resolves to bear office under Diabolus, that he might, such one as he was, be a petty ruler and govern in Mansell. And, headstrong man that he was, thus he began betimes. For this man, when Diabolus did make his oration at Eargate, was one of the first that was for consenting to his words, and for accepting of his counsel as wholesome, and that was for opening the gate, and letting him into the town. Wherefore Diabolus had a kindness for him, and for that reason designed him for a place. And perceiving the valor and stoutness of the man, he coveted to have him for one of his great ones, to act and do in matters of the highest concern. So he sent for him and talked with him of that secret matter which lay in his breast. But there needed not much persuasion in the case, for as at first he was willing that Diabolus should be led into the town, so now he was willing to serve him there. When the tyrant therefore perceived the willingness of my lord to serve him, and that his mind stood bending that way, he forthwith made him captain of the castle, governor of the wall, and keeper of the gates of Mansell. Yea, there was a clause in his commission that nothing without him should be done in all the town of Mansell, so that now next to Diabolus himself, who but my lord will be will, in all the town of Mansell, nor could anything be now done, but at his will and pleasure throughout the town of Mansell. Let's see, the mind and will subject to Satan. Let's see, throughout the town of Mansell, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. Romans chapter 8, verse 7. Let's see. Throughout the town of Mansell, he had also one Mr. Mind for his clerk, a man to speak on every way like his master. For he and his Lord were in principle one, and in practice not far asunder. And now was Mansell brought under to purpose and made to fulfill the lusts of the will and of the mind. Let's see. And in practice not far asunder. wherein in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience, among whom also we all had our conversation in times past in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature the children of wrath, even as others. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Let's see. So man's soul was brought under the purpose and made to fulfill the lusts of the will and of the mind. But it will not be out of my thoughts. What a desperate one this will was, when power was put into his hand. First, he flatly denied that he owed any suit or service to his former prince and liege lord. This done, in the next place, he took an oath, swore fidelity to his great master Diabolus, and then being stated and settled in his place, office, advancement, and preferment. Oh, you cannot think, unless you had seen it, the strange work that this workman made in the town of Mansoul. The law of God hateful to a sinful mind. First, he maligned Mr. Recorder to death. He would neither endure to see him nor hear the words of his mouth. He would shut his eyes when he saw him, and stop his ears when he heard him speak. Also he could not endure that so much as a fragment of Shaddai should be anywhere seen in the town. For example, his clerk, Mr. Mind, had some old rent and torn parchments of the law of good Shaddai in his house. But when Will saw them, he cast them behind his back. Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against thee, and cast thy law behind their backs, and slew thy prophets, which testified against them, to turn them to thee, and they wrought great provocations. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 26. Let's see. Will saw them, he cast them behind his back. True, Mr. Recorder had some of the laws in his study, but my lord could by no means come at them. He also thought and said, the windows of my old Lord Mayor's house were always too light for the profit of the town of Mansoul. The light of a candle he could not endure. Now nothing at all pleased Will, but what pleased Diabolus his lord. There was no other like him to trumpet about the streets the brave nature, the wise conduct, and the great glory of the king Diabolus. He would range throughout all the streets of Mansoul to cry up his illustrious lord, and would make himself even an abject among the base and rascally crew, to cry up his valiant prince. And I say, when and wheresoever he found those vassals, he would even make himself as one of them. In an ill courses, he would act without bidding, and do mischief without commandment. The products of vile affections. The Lord Will also had a deputy under him, and his name was Mr. Affection, one that was also greatly debauched in his principles, and answered thereto in his life, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Romans chapter 1, verse 25. Okay, and answered thereto in his life. He was only given to the flesh, and therefore they call him vile affection. Now there was he, and carnal lust, the daughter of Mr. Mind. Like to like, quoth the devil to the collier, that fell in love and made a match and were married. And as I take it, they had several children, as Impudence, Black Mouth, and Hate Reproof. These three were black boys, and besides these three, they had 3 daughters, as Scorn Truth, Slight God, and the name of the youngest was Revenge. These were all married in the town, and also begot and yielded many bad brats, too many to be inserted, but to pass by this. When the giant had thus engarrisoned himself in the town of Mansoul, and had put down and set up whom he thought good, he betakes himself to defacing the image of God erased from the sinner's mind. Now there was in the marketplace of Mansoul, and also upon the gates of the castle, an image of the blessed King Shaddai. This image was so exactly graven, and it was engraven in gold, that it did the most resemble Shaddai himself of anything that then was extant in the world. This he basely commanded to be defaced, and it was basely done by the hand of Mr. No Truth. Now you must know that as Diabolus had commanded, and that by the hand of Mr. No Truth, the image of Shaddai was defaced. He likewise gave order that the same Mr. No Truth should set up in its stead the horrid and formidable image of Diabolus, to the great contempt of the former king, and debasing his town of Mansoul. Moreover, Diabolus made havoc of all remains of the laws and statutes of Shaddai that could be found in the town of Mansoul, to wit, such as contained either doctrines or morals, with all civil and natural documents. Also relative duties he sought to extinguish. To be short, there was no thing of the remains of good in Mansoul, which he and will sought not to destroy, for their design was to turn Mansoul into a brute, and to make it like to the sensual sow, by the hand of Mr. No Truth. When he had destroyed what law and good orders he could, then further to effect his design, namely, to alienate Mansoul from Shaddai her king, he commands, and they set up his own edicts, statutes, and commandments in all places of resort or concourse in Mansoul, to wit, such as gave liberty to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which are not of Shaddai, but of the world. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. 1 John chapter 2, verse 16.